The gold on my wrist was screaming success, but the cold steel on my skin was whispering criminal. It's funny how fast the world can flip on you. 1 minute, I'm the king of a mahogany boardroom on the 42nd floor, signing papers that move $50 million like it's pocket change. I'm leaning back in a leather chair, sipping espresso that costs more than my first car, feeling like I finally made it. I was wearing a 3-piece charcoal suit, tailored so perfectly it felt like armor. I felt untouchable. But 30 minutes later, standing in the middle of Penn Station, that armor didn't mean a damn thing. All they saw was the skin underneath. Before I get into the grit of this, I want to ask you something. Have you ever felt like you climbed the highest mountain, planted your flag, and then someone came along and told you that you didn't even have permission to stand on the dirt at the bottom? It's a heart-ripping kind of pain. Man, it makes you question every late night, every sacrifice, every time you swallowed your pride to get ahead. If you've ever felt like a ghost in your own life, or if you're watching this from a place where you feel like you have to hide who you are just to survive, drop a comment. Tell me where you're watching from. I need to know I'm not just shouting into an empty room today. And look, if this story hits home, if it makes you feel something real, hit that subscribe button. We need to stick together in this world. Let's go back to that afternoon. The air in New York was thick. That heavy, humid summer air that smells like hot asphalt, old trash, and a million people's dreams all colliding at once. I was on a high. The merger was done. I was heading to the airport to catch a flight to LA to see my daughter. I had my briefcase in one hand, a sleek, Italian leather thing that held the future of my company, and a first-class ticket in my pocket. I was walking through Penn Station, heading toward the terminal to catch the train to the airport. I was moving with purpose, the way a man who knows his value moves. I was passing by the luxury lounge, thinking about what I'd buy my girl for her graduation. Maybe a car. Yeah, she earned it. I was smiling. Then, I felt the air shift. You know that feeling when the temperature in the room just drops. When the hair on the back of your neck stands up. Because you know, eyes are on you. I didn't even have to look. I've lived in this body for 52 years. I know the look. 2 officers, both white, both young enough to be my sons, but with eyes that held the weight of 1,000 years of suspicion. They weren't looking at my suit. They weren't looking at the way I carried myself. They were looking at my hands, my face, my presence, as if I were a stain on a clean floor. I tried to keep walking. I told myself, calm down. David, you're a CEO. You're a taxpayer. You belong here. Hey, you... Stop right there. The voice was like a whip. It cut through the noise of the commuters, the announcements, the shuffling feet. I stopped. I didn't turn around fast. You never turn around fast. You move like you're underwater. You move so they don't have an excuse to say you were reaching. I turned, keeping my hands visible, clutching that expensive briefcase like it was a life raft. Officer, is there a problem? I asked. I kept my voice smooth. Boardroom smooth. I used my professional voice, the one I use to calm nervous investors. Where are you going in such a hurry? The taller one asked. He didn't have his hand on his holster, but his fingers were twitching near it. I'm heading to the airport, I said, nodding toward the signs. I have a flight to catch. We had a report of a suspect in the area. The shorter one said. He stepped closer, entering my personal space. I could smell the stale coffee on his breath and the scent of iron from his gear. Matches your description. Black male, middle-aged, carrying a bag. You got some ID. I felt a surge of heat in my chest. A description, In Penn Station, on a Tuesday afternoon, there were 1,000 men who fit that description if you looked only at the surface. I reached slowly into my pocket to get my wallet. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. "Sir, keep your hands where I can see them," the tall one barked. I froze. "I'm just getting my ID. Officer." "Like you asked." "Get against the wall," he said. The world went silent. It was that ringing silence you get right after a loud explosion. I looked around. People were stopping. Commuters in their own suits. Tourists with their cameras. Kids with their backpacks. They were watching. I saw a woman pull her purse closer to her chest. I saw a man look away quickly, his face full of that polite discomfort, the kind where they aren't angry at the injustice. They're just embarrassed to see it. I felt the brick wall against my palms. It was cold and rough. I had to put my briefcase down on the dirty floor. That leather, that symbol of my hard work, sitting in the grime of 1,000 footsteps. I felt the hands on me, rough, disrespectful. They weren't just checking for weapons. They were checking for my dignity. They patted down the legs of my trousers, the sleeves of my jacket. They felt the silk lining and didn't care. To them, I wasn't David Miller, the man who just saved 300 jobs in Ohio. I was just a black male, middle-aged. "What's in the bag?" the short one asked, kicking my briefcase. "Business documents," I said, my voice cracking just a little. I hated that crack. I hated that I felt like a little boy again. Back in Alabama, watching my father get pulled over for driving too nice a car. My father always told me, "David, the suit is your shield. If you look like them, they'll treat you like them." Well, Dad, you were wrong. The shield was made of paper. They opened the briefcase. They ruffled through the contracts. These were confidential documents, things people had signed non-disclosure agreements for. They tossed them around like they were grocery flyers. They found my gold watch, the one I'd taken off to clear security earlier, and the tall one held it up, squinting at it. "Nice watch," he said. His voice was dripping with something foul. "How does a guy like you get a watch like this?" "I worked for it," I said. My jaw was so tight it ached. "I am the CEO of Miller and Associates. If you check the ID in my wallet, you'll see my credentials. I have a first-class ticket to LAX in my breast pocket." The silence stretched out. They looked at my ID. They looked at the ticket. I watched their faces. They didn't look guilty. They didn't look sorry. They just looked annoyed, like I was a puzzle they couldn't be bothered to solve. They realized I wasn't their suspect. Or maybe they realized I had enough money to make their lives difficult if they pushed too hard. "Fine," the tall one said, shoving my ID back at me. He didn't hand it to me. He let it fall to the floor. "Matches the ID. You're free to go. But stay out of trouble. Stay out of trouble." I was the one being harassed. I was the one being shoved against a wall in front of the world. They didn't help me pick up my papers. They didn't apologize for the dirt on my suit. They just turned and walked away, talking to each other as if I had already ceased to exist. I stood there for a long time. I didn't move. I couldn't. My legs felt like they were made of lead. I looked down at my documents scattered on the floor. My hands were shaking. Not because I was scared. The fear had passed. But because of the rage. It was a cold, deep rage that starts in the marrow of your bones and works its way out. It's the kind of rage that makes you want to scream until your throat bleeds. But you can't, because if you scream, you become the angry black man. If you scream, you prove them right. I knelt down. Slowly, one by one, I picked up the papers. I wiped the dust off my briefcase with my sleeve. I tucked my ID back into my wallet. I felt every eye in that station on me. I felt the weight of their pity. And honestly, the pity was almost worse than the suspicion. I didn't want their poor man looks. I wanted my 30 minutes back. I wanted the feeling of being untouchable back. I stood up and straightened my tie. I checked my reflection in the glass of a closed shop. I looked the same. The suit was still charcoal. The shirt was still crisp white. But the man inside was different. The man inside was reminded that the world has a very long memory, and it doesn't care about your resume. I started walking again. My heart was still thumping, a dull rhythm in my ears. I made my way toward the gate for the airport link. Each step felt heavier than the last. The noise of the station started to fade into a blur. I wasn't thinking about the $50 million merger anymore. I wasn't thinking about the graduation gift. I was thinking about the fact that I had to get on a plane and sit next to people who might have been standing in that station watching me get pushed against a wall. I reached the platform. The train was humming, a low vibration beneath my feet. I stood there, clutching the handle of my briefcase so hard my knuckles were white. I watched the doors open, the light from inside the carriage spilling out onto the platform like a spotlight. I wasn't sure I wanted to step into. I took a deep breath, trying to force the air into lungs that felt like they were shrinking. I stepped forward, my shoes clicking on the metal gap between the platform and the train, feeling the sudden change from the open air of the station to the cramped, artificial coolness of the car. I found a seat, sat down, and stared at my own reflection in the darkened window as the train began to pull away, my face a ghost haunting the glass. The tunnel lights flickered past, rhythmic and cold, like a heartbeat that wasn't mine anymore. Each flash against the train window felt like a strobe light, exposing a crime that hadn't been committed. I sat there, centered in that plush seat, but my spirit was still back there, pressed against the grid of the Penn Station masonry. It's a strange thing, man, how you can be moving at 60 miles an hour toward a better life, yet feel like you're anchored to the very spot where someone tried to take your soul. I looked at my hands. They were steady now, but they felt heavy. They felt like they were stained with the dust of that floor, a dust that no amount of expensive soap in a first-class lounge was ever going to truly wash away. I tried to close my eyes, to find that CEO headspace where I solve problems and navigate crises, but all I could hear was the click of those boots on the marble and the way that young officer said "you people" without actually saying the words. It's the silence between the syllables that kills you. It's the way the air gets thin when you enter a room you're allowed to be in, but not expected to be in. I reached up and adjusted my tie, a habit. Really. But the silk felt like a noose. My father used to tell me that a well-dressed man is a protected man. He believed in the armor of the aesthetic. He thought if I looked like the board of directors, I'd be treated like the chairman. But sitting on that train, watching the New Jersey marshlands blur into a gray-green smudge, I realized the armor was transparent. They see right through the wool, right through the silk, right down to the fear they want you to carry. I arrived at the airport terminal, and the transition from the chaotic grime of the city to the sterile, climate-controlled luxury of the airport felt like stepping into a different dimension. But the feeling followed me. It's like a shadow that doesn't need a sun. I walked toward the sky priority line, my briefcase clutched tight. I saw the agent, a woman with a tight bun and a smile that looked like it had been painted on by a committee. She was chatting warmly with a man in a golf shirt ahead of me. They were laughing about some delay in Chicago. When I stepped up, the laugh died. It didn't scream. It just withered. "May I see your ticket and passport?" "Please," she asked. Her voice was 3 degrees colder than it had been 10 seconds ago. I handed them over. I watched her eyes. She looked at the first class designation, then at me, then back at the ticket. She did it 3 times. It wasn't a quick glance. It was a forensic study. She was looking for the forgery. She was looking for the mistake that would allow her to point me toward the back of the bus. "Is there a problem?" I asked, keeping my voice low, resonant, just verifying the information. "Sir," she said, though she didn't call me sir, the way she'd called the guy in the golf shirt sir. My sir had an invisible question mark at the end of it. She eventually handed them back, her fingers careful not to touch mine. I walked toward the lounge, the thick carpet muffling my footsteps. But in my head, I was still hearing the echoes of Penn Station. I sat in a corner of the lounge, tucked away near a window overlooking the tarmac. I needed to see the sky. I needed to remember that the world was bigger than a police officer's narrow mind. I ordered a bourbon. Neat. I didn't even want it. But I needed something to hold. Something that felt solid. I watched a group of businessmen a few tables over. They were loud, confident, taking up space without an ounce of apology. They were talking about quarterly earnings and their kids' private schools. I could have joined that conversation. I knew their metrics. I knew their struggle. But I sat there in silence because I knew that if I spoke, the vibe would shift. I'd be the intruder again. I'd be the one they'd have to account for. So I stayed small. A CEO with a multi-million-dollar portfolio, making himself small in a room he paid to be in. Do you know how much that burns? It's a slow, smoldering heat that eats at your self-respect. Before I go further, let me just say this. I know some of you are thinking, "David, you're successful. You're rich. Why does it matter?" It matters because the money is just a coat of paint. It doesn't change the structure of the house. If you understand what I'm saying. If you've ever been the only person in a high-end room who felt like they were being watched by the hidden cameras, let me know. Drop a "I see you" in the comments. We have to acknowledge these invisible weights, or they'll eventually crush us. The boarding call for the flight to LAX finally came. I stood up, straightened my jacket, and walked toward the gate. I felt a weird sense of relief. Once I was on that plane, once we were at 30,000 feet, I'd be in a different jurisdiction. The clouds don't have a description for who gets to fly through them. Or so I thought. I walked down the jet bridge, that narrow, humming tube that feels like a transition between worlds. I stepped onto the plane and was greeted by a flight attendant. Let's call her Ilana. She had that professional, polished look. But as soon as I turned left toward the first-class cabin, I saw her eyes flicker. It was a micro-expression, gone in a heartbeat. But I've spent 20 years reading people across negotiation tables. I know a "what is he doing here" look when I see one. I found my seat. 1A. The throne. Extra legroom. A window view. And the smell of fresh leather. I put my briefcase in the overhead bin, making sure to handle it gently. I sat down and buckled my belt. I wanted to just disappear into the seat. I wanted to close the world out. That's when he walked in. He was younger, maybe early 30s. Blue button-down shirt, expensive jeans, the kind of haircut that costs $200 to look like you just rolled out of bed. He was seat 1B. He looked at me. Then he looked at his ticket. Then he looked at the seat number on the wall. He did this twice. He sat down, but he didn't settle. He was stiff. He pulled his backpack onto his lap and started rummaging through it. But his eyes kept darting toward me. It wasn't a look of curiosity. It was a look of profound, Unearned discomfort. He clutched his bag to his chest like I was going to snatch it and run down the aisle. I decided to be the bigger man. I always am. It's the tax I pay for existing. Good afternoon, I said, offering a small, polite nod. He didn't answer. He just tightened his grip on his bag and looked out the window. The air between us suddenly felt like it was made of lead. It was that weight of the air I told you about. It's thick. It's suffocating. And it tells you exactly where you stand, without a single word being spoken. I saw him lean over and press the call button. Elena came over a moment later. Yes, Mr. Henderson. Can I get you a pre-departure drink? He leaned in close to her. He whispered, but he didn't whisper low enough. Or maybe I've just become hyper-attuned to the frequency of fear. Sure, this is the right passenger list. I heard him mutter, just seemed a bit unusual. I saw him in the station earlier. Acting. Frantic. My blood turned to ice. Frantic. I was being harassed by police. I was trying to collect my life's work from a dirty floor. And this kid, this Henderson, saw my trauma and interpreted it as suspicious behavior. Elena looked at me. It wasn't the look of a host. It was the look of a guard. She didn't smile. She didn't offer me a drink. Sir, she said, standing over me, I'm going to need to see your boarding pass one more time. There seems to be a slight discrepancy in the seating chart. I felt the eyes of the other passengers in the first 3 rows. The cabin was quiet. The only sound was the low hum of the APU and the rustle of newspapers. I felt that heat in my chest again. That Alabama sun my father told me about. I already showed my pass at the gate. And to you when I boarded, I said. I kept my voice steady. But the CEO was starting to slip. The man was taking over. I understand, sir, but we just need to verify for the manifest. She insisted. Her hand was held out. Palm up. It felt like a demand for a ransom. I reached into my pocket. My fingers were cold. I pulled out the pass and handed it to her. She took it, walked 3 steps away, and started talking into her headset. She was looking at me while she talked. Henderson was looking at his shoes, pretending he wasn't the one who pulled the trigger on this whole situation. I pulled out my wallet. I pulled out my driver's license. I held it up. I didn't hand it to her this time. I wanted her to have to lean in. I wanted her to have to look at the man, not just the plastic. My name is David Miller, I said, my voice dropping an octave, echoing with the authority I had earned over 3 decades of grit. I am a frequent flyer with this airline. I have more miles than this plane has probably flown. Now, is there an actual problem with my seat? Or are we just performing for Mr. Henderson here? Henderson flinched. Elena's face went flush, a blotchy red creeping up her neck. She didn't answer. She just took a photo of my ID with a handheld device and walked away toward the cockpit. The plane began to push back from the gate. The tug hummed beneath us, a jarring vibration that shook the floorboards. I sat back, my heart racing, the bourbon sitting untouched in the cup holder. I looked out the window as the terminal began to recede. I thought I was leaving the trouble on the ground. I thought the sky would be different. But as the plane turned toward the taxiway, I saw the blue and white lights of an airport police cruiser pacing us on the service road. I looked at Henderson. He was staring straight ahead now, his jaw set, his hand still white-knuckled around the straps of his bag. The plane slowed to a crawl. We weren't heading for the runway. We were turning toward a remote stand, a patch of concrete far away from the main gates, where the lights were dim and the shadows were long. I felt a sickening lurch in my stomach, a physical manifestation of the dread that had been building since that first click of the handcuffs at Penn Station. The fasten seatbelt sign dinged, but it sounded like a warning bell. Elena came back into the cabin, her face pale, her eyes avoiding mine entirely as she went to the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing a minor technical issue." She lied. Her voice was trembling. "Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened. We will have more information shortly." The plane came to a complete stop. The engines began to wind down, the roar fading into a ghostly whistle. In the sudden silence of the cabin, I could hear the heavy thud of boots hitting the stairs of a mobile boarding ramp being wheeled up to the front door. I looked at my reflection in the window, but the ghost was gone. All that was left was a man in an expensive suit, waiting for the door to open and the nightmare to begin again. My hand moved instinctively to my briefcase, my fingers tracing the cold, smooth leather as the first heavy knock echoed against the fuselage. The seal of the main cabin door broke with a pneumatic hiss that sounded like a final gasp of air. It wasn't just a door opening. It was the collapse of the only sanctuary I had left. I watched the heavy slab of composite and metal swing outward, revealing a slice of the California dusk, a bruised purple sky that felt mocking in its beauty. But I wasn't looking at the sunset. I was looking at the two silhouettes standing at the top of the mobile stairs. They weren't flight crew. They were dressed in the tactical black of airport security, their utility belts clinking with the tools of a trade I had spent my entire life trying to avoid. One of them stepped inside. He was thick-necked, with a buzz cut and a face that looked like it had been carved out of granite. He didn't look at the flight attendant. He didn't look at the pilot who had peeked his head out from the cockpit. He scanned the first-class cabin with a predatory slowness until his eyes locked onto my seat, my space, my $4,000 cage. "David Miller," he called out. He didn't use a question mark. It was a summons. I felt the entire cabin hold its breath. You could hear the hum of the air conditioning, a sound that suddenly felt loud enough to shatter glass. Every head in that section turned. I felt the heat of their collective gaze, a mixture of shock, morbid curiosity, and that terrifying. I knew its suspicion that hangs over men like me, like a persistent fog. Next to me, Henderson, the kid who had whispered the poison into the flight attendant's ear, made a small, strangled sound in his throat. He pulled his legs back as far as they would go, trying to create as much distance between us as possible, as if my guilt was a contagious disease he might catch if our suits touched. I looked at him for just a second. He was sweating. The architect of this humiliation was more afraid than the man he had targeted. "I'm David Miller," I said. I didn't stand up yet. I stayed seated, keeping my back straight, my hands folded neatly on my lap. I wanted him to see the composure. I wanted him to see that he was interrupting a man of substance, not a man of chaos. "We need you to gather your belongings and step off the aircraft." "Sir," the officer said. He stepped closer, his hand hovering near his hip, not on the gun, but close enough to remind me it was there. "On what grounds?" I asked. My voice was a low rumble, the kind I use when a board member tries to pull a fast one during a closing. "I've been vetted by the TSA. I've been verified by your flight crew. I am a paying passenger on this flight. There's been a report of suspicious activity and a potential security mismatch," he said, his tone flat. "Board. We'll discuss it on the tarmac. Stand up." Now. The now was the breaking point. It was the sound of the leash tightening. I felt a surge of something hot and jagged in my gut, a raw, primal anger that wanted to roar. I wanted to stand up and scream that I owned more of this world than he ever would. I wanted to throw my credentials in his face. I wanted to demand a lawyer, a manager, the CEO of the damn airline. But then, I saw it. In the reflection of the overhead light on the officer's badge, I didn't see myself. I saw my son, Marcus. Marcus is 22. He's got my jawline and his mother's eyes. He's brilliant, graduating top of his class, heading into the world with a heart full of fire and a mind full of dreams. And I realized that if I reacted the way I wanted to, if I became the angry black man they were waiting for, I was just reinforcing the walls they were building around him. If I let my rage dictate this moment, I was losing the battle for his future. The anger didn't leave me, but it changed. It crystallized. It turned from a wildfire into a diamond. Hard, cold, and unbreakable. I stood up. I didn't move fast. I moved with a deliberate, agonizing slowness. I reached into the overhead bin and retrieved my briefcase. I felt the weight of it, the contracts, the plans, the legacy. I tucked it under my arm. I straightened my jacket, smoothing out the invisible wrinkles. I adjusted my cuffs, making sure the gold links caught the light. I will step off this plane, I said, my voice carrying to the very back of the cabin. Not because I have anything to hide, but because I have a daughter waiting for me. And I refuse to let your ignorance keep me from her for 1 second longer than necessary. But understand this. When I walk back on this plane, and I will walk back on, there will be a reckoning for this. I walked toward the door. Every step felt like walking through deep water. I passed the woman in 2A, who was holding her phone up, recording. I passed the man in 3B, who shook his head in a way that felt like a eulogy for my dignity. I reached the door and stepped out onto the metal platform. The wind hit me first. It was a sharp, cooling breeze that smelled of jet fuel and salt air. Below me, the tarmac was a sea of gray concrete, illuminated by the harsh, flickering orange of the airport floodlights. There were 3 more officers down there, standing near a black SUV. They looked like statues. When I reached the bottom, the lead officer gestured toward the SUV. "Inside," he said. "No," I said. I stood my ground. "We can talk right here, in the light, where the cameras can see us." I pointed to the security towers and the phones pressed against the windows of the plane. "You want to treat this like a public security matter? Then let's keep it public." He hesitated. He wasn't used to a suspect who knew the geometry of the room. He looked at his partner, then back at me. "We had a report from a passenger that you were seen in Penn Station acting erratic, possibly involved in a theft, and that you bypassed security protocols," he said. I almost laughed. It was so transparent, so lazy. I was stopped at Penn Station by 2 officers who found absolutely nothing. I passed through 3 layers of airport security. I am a Delta Diamond Medallion member. Do you honestly think I bypassed anything? The passenger claimed he saw you hiding something in your briefcase. The officer continued, but I could hear the doubt creeping into his voice. He was looking at my suit again. He was looking at the way I stood, feet shoulder-width apart, chin up, eyes locked on his. I wasn't flinching. I wasn't looking at the ground. "What I have in this briefcase is a merger agreement for a company that employs 4,000 people in this state," I said. "And if you open it, without a warrant, I will spend every dime I have making sure you're directing traffic in a rural county for the rest of your career." The silence on the tarmac was different than the silence on the plane. It was vast. It was heavy. It was the sound of a man standing on the edge of a cliff, realizing he wasn't the one who was going to fall. I looked up at the plane. I could see the silhouette of Henderson in the window of 1B. He was watching, He looked small. He looked like a child who had set a fire and realized he couldn't put it out. And in that moment, I realized that his fear wasn't my burden. His prejudice wasn't my shame. The officer's radio crackled. A voice came through, distorted and tinny. I couldn't make out the words, but the officer's posture shifted. He lowered his hand from his belt. He took a half step back. "Stand by," he muttered into his shoulder mic. He looked at me, his eyes searching my face for a crack, for a sign that I was bluffing. But he found nothing but the cold, hard truth of a man who had already been through the fire. He looked down at his clipboard, then back at the SUV, and finally, he looked me in the eye with an expression that wasn't an apology, but was the closest thing I was going to get to one, a reluctant recognition of a peer. He cleared his throat, the sound swallowed by the distant roar of a taking-off engine, and I watched his finger hover over the release button on his radio as the wind whipped my tie across my shoulder, the silk snapping like a flag in a storm. The radio on that officer's shoulder let out another sharp, static-filled burst, a sound that felt like a jagged blade cutting through the heavy, salt-tinged air of the tarmac. I didn't blink. I didn't shift my weight. I just watched his eyes as they moved from the SUV back to me, the hostility in them slowly being replaced by a confused, almost panicked realization. He didn't look like a hunter anymore. He looked like a man who had just realized he was standing on a landmine of his own making. "Copy that," he muttered into the mic, his voice dropping an octave. He looked at the other officers, then back at me, clearing his throat with a sound that was far too small for the space we were in. "Mr. Miller, there's been a misunderstanding at the dispatch level. The report from Penn Station has been cleared, and the passengers claim it appears there was a misidentification of a potential threat. A misunderstanding. That's the word they always use, isn't it? It's a clean, sterile word for a dirty, messy reality. It's the word that's supposed to wash away the shame of being marched off a plane in front of 100 people. It's the word that's supposed to mend the heart-ripping pain of being told your face is a description of a crime. A misunderstanding, I repeated, letting the word hang in the air like smoke. Is that what you call it when you pull a man out of a first-class seat because someone didn't like the way he looked in a train station? Is that the official terminology? He didn't answer. He couldn't. He just stepped aside, gesturing toward the stairs of the plane. "You're cleared to reboard, sir. The flight will depart as soon as you're seated. We apologize for the delay." He didn't answer. He couldn't. He just stepped aside, gesturing toward the stairs of the plane. "You're cleared to reboard, sir. The flight will depart as soon as you're seated. We apologize for the delay." I looked at the stairs. They looked a mile high. Every step back up that metal ramp felt like a pound of lead was tied to my ankles. I felt like I was walking back into a courtroom where the jury had already decided I was guilty, and the judge had just forgotten to sign the papers. But I didn't hesitate. I adjusted the strap of my briefcase, felt the cool leather against my palm, and began the climb. When I stepped back through that cabin door, the silence was different. It wasn't the shocked silence from before. It was a thick, heavy, awkward silence. The kind of silence that happens when people realize they've been cheering for the wrong side. Elena, the flight attendant, was standing there, her hands clasped in front of her, her face a mask of professional regret that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Mr. Miller, I am so sorry," she whispered as I passed her. "We were just following." I didn't let her finish. "I know exactly what you were following," I said, not even breaking my stride. I walked back into the first-class cabin. I felt the eyes. Row 2A, row 3B. The cameras were down now, but the judgment was still there, lingering in the recycled air. I reached seat 1A and stood there for a second, looking down at the man in 1B, Mr. Henderson. He looked like he wanted to crawl under the floorboards. He was staring at his tray table, his face a ghostly white, his hands shaking as he tried to open a bag of pretzels. I didn't sit down. I just stood there, towering over him, letting the shadow of my suit fall across his lap. I felt a strange, cold clarity. I knew this kid. Not personally, but I knew the type. He was the product of a world that taught him to fear what he didn't understand, and to use his voice to silence anyone who made him feel unusual. I reached into my briefcase, pulled out my tablet, and tapped a few icons. I looked at the name on the flight manifest Henderson had whispered to Elena. Henderson. Brian Henderson. I did a quick search through the internal directory of the firm I'd just acquired, the one that had made me the king of the world only a few hours ago. And there he was, Brian Henderson, junior analyst, mergers and acquisitions. He was one of mine. He was one of mine. The irony was so sharp it almost made me laugh. This kid, who had spent the last hour trying to have me arrested, was technically working for me as of 2:0 p.m. today. He didn't know it yet. He hadn't seen the welcome email with my face at the top. He had just seen a black man in a station, felt a flicker of baseless suspicion, and decided to act on it. I sat down. I moved slowly, making sure he felt every inch of my presence. I leaned over, not in a threatening way, but in a way that ensured he couldn't ignore me. Brian, I said, my voice barely a whisper, yet carrying the weight of a mountain. He jumped, nearly spilling his drink. He looked at me, his eyes wide, his mouth hanging open like a fish out of water. I'm sorry. You don't know me, I said, holding his gaze. But you will. On Monday morning, when you walk into the office for the all-hands meeting to meet your new chairman, I want you to remember this moment. I want you to remember the tarmac. I want you to remember the feeling of watching a man be humiliated because you decided your hunch was more important than his humanity. He turned a shade of gray I didn't know was possible. He tried to speak, but only a small, pathetic squeak came out. I'm not going to fire you, Brian. I continued, and I meant it. Firing him was too easy. It would just make him a martyr for his own prejudice. I'm going to make you work for me. I'm going to make you sit in meetings with me. I'm going to make you look at me every single day until you realize that the man you saw in Penn Station is the same man who signs your paycheck. I'm going to make you see me, truly see me. I turned away from him and looked out the window. The plane began to move again, the engines roaring to life as we taxied toward the runway. I felt the vibration of the floor, the surge of power as the pilot opened the throttles. We lifted off, the lights of the city shrinking below us, becoming nothing more than a carpet of flickering diamonds. The sky was black, vast, and indifferent. Up here, at 30,000 feet, the suits and the titles and the descriptions didn't seem to matter as much, but the weight in my chest was still there. It was a heavy, dull ache that told me that no matter how high I flew, the ground was always waiting. But then, I thought about the way I stood my ground on that tarmac. I thought about the quiet dignity I'd found in the middle of the storm. I realized that the invisible suit my father talked about wasn't about the clothes. It was about the spirit. It was about the refusal to let someone else's narrow mind define the boundaries of your soul. I leaned my head back against the headrest and closed my eyes. The flight was long, but for the first time in my life, I wasn't in a hurry to get where I was going. I just wanted to be. I wanted to sit in the silence and breathe. Let me tell you something. Before I go, this story, it isn't just about me. It's about every single one of us who has ever been told we don't belong. It's about the fact that making it doesn't mean the fight is over. It just means the battlefield has changed. If you're still here, if you've listened to this all the way through, I want you to do something for me. I want you to think about the Hendersons in your own life. The people who look at you and see a description instead of a person. And I want you to decide, right now, that you're not going to let them win. You're going to keep climbing. You're going to keep building. You're going to make them see you. Drop a comment below if you've ever had to prove you belong in a room you already owned. Let's talk about it. Let's make sure these stories don't stay hidden in the dark. And if you want to be part of a community that stands for the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it gets, hit that subscribe button. We've got a lot more ground to cover. I'm going to spend the rest of this flight thinking about my daughter's graduation. I'm going to think about the look on her face when she sees me. And I'm going to remind myself that the view from above is beautiful, even if the climb is hell. Peace. I unbuckled my seatbelt as the fasten seatbelt sign finally went dark. The soft click echoing in the quiet cabin, and I reached for the glass of bourbon that had been sitting there since we left the gate, finally taking a sip as the ice rattled against the crystal. A cold, sharp reminder that I was still here, still standing, and still the one in control of the narrative. You ever feel the weight of your own skin? I don't mean the physical weight, the muscles, the bones, the biology of it all. I mean the weight that society presses onto it until you feel like you're carrying a mountain on your shoulders just to walk down the street. It's a heavy thing. Heavier than any boardroom pressure I've ever faced. And trust me, I've sat across from some sharks. I've closed deals that would make your head spin, managed budgets with more zeros than I care to count, and built a life that most people only see in magazines. But none of that mattered on that Tuesday morning. Not the title, not the bank account, and certainly not the $3. Zero, zero, zero. Italian wool suit I was wearing. I was standing in the middle of Penn Station, the heart of New York City, and for the first time in 20 years, I felt like a ghost, or worse, a target. Before I dive into the chaos of what happened next, I want to ask you something. Have you ever felt like you finally made it? Like you finally climbed the highest peak, only to realize the ground beneath you was never solid to begin with? Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching this from. I want to know who is out there listening, because sometimes, in this world, just being heard is a victory. And if you're new here, hit that subscribe button. We're building a space for the truth, even when it's uncomfortable. Especially when it's uncomfortable. The morning started perfectly. Too perfectly. Looking back, I had a 10:00 a.m. flight out of JFK, but I decided to take the train into the city first to wrap up a few things. I was heading to a merger, the kind of merger that changes the trajectory of a company. My company. I had my leather briefcase in one hand and a lukewarm espresso in the other. I looked good, and I felt even better. I remember catching my reflection in a store window and thinking, Rowan, you've come a long way from that kid in the South Side. I was wearing my power suit, midnight blue, tailored to the inch. It was my armor. It told the world I was a man of substance, a man who belonged in the rooms where the big decisions get made. But the thing about armor is that it only works if the person looking at you recognizes it as armor. To some people, it's just camouflage. The station was a sea of moving bodies. Thousands of people rushing toward their futures, eyes glued to their phones, dodging each other like it was a choreographed dance. I was part of that dance. I was checking my watch, calculating the time it would take to get to the gate, thinking about the speech I was going to give to the board. Then, I felt it. That prickle on the back of your neck when you know eyes are on you. Not the look at that successful man eyes. The what is he doing here eyes. I slowed my pace. I didn't want to look like I was in a hurry. That's a rule you learn early when you look like me. Never run. Never look frantic. Always look like you have a reason to be exactly where you are. I turned my head slightly and saw them. 2 officers. White. Late 20s. Maybe. They were leaning against a pillar, watching the crowd. When our eyes met, they didn't look away. They locked in. "Excuse me, sir. Can we have a word?" The voice was loud, cutting through the ambient roar of the station. I stopped. I didn't turn around immediately. I took a breath first. I composed my face into that neutral, professional mask I've used in 100 negotiations. I turned around, a polite, confused smile on my face. "Me?" I asked, my voice smooth and controlled. "Yes. You. Step over here. Please." They didn't say sir that time. The tone had shifted. I walked over, my heart starting a slow, heavy thud against my ribs. I kept my hands visible, clutching my briefcase. I knew the drill. I've known it since I was 16. It doesn't matter if you're a CEO or a college student. The script is the same. "Is there a problem, officers?" I asked. "We've had reports of some suspicious activity in the terminal. You fit the description of a suspect we're looking for." The taller one said. He had a buzz cut and eyes that looked right through me like I was a piece of plexiglass. I felt a bitter laugh bubble up in my throat, but I choked it down. "A description. I'm sure there are plenty of men in blue suits today. I'm actually on my way to a very important meeting. I have my ID, my tickets. I didn't ask about your meeting." He snapped. "I asked you to step over here. Put the bag down." The station around us seemed to go quiet, even though I knew the noise hadn't stopped. It was like a vacuum had formed around the 3 of us. People were starting to look. I saw a businessman in a gray suit, roughly my age, walk past. He didn't even glance our way. He was allowed to be invisible. I wasn't. I was a spectacle. I put the briefcase down on the dirty floor. The leather scratched against the grit, a sound that felt like a physical sting. I felt the cold air of the station crawling up my sleeves, hands where I can see them. The shorter officer said. He moved to my side, his hand hovering near his belt. "Officers, look at me," I said, trying to appeal to their logic. "I am the CEO of a major firm. I have a flight to catch. If you just check my credentials, sir, stop resisting and follow instructions." The tall one barked. I wasn't resisting. I hadn't moved a muscle. But resisting is a magic word. Once they say it, the rules change. I felt the first surge of real fear then. Not the fear of being arrested, but the fear of how easily I could be erased. All the work, the late nights, the sacrifices, it could all be undone in a second by a man who didn't like the way I looked in a midnight blue suit. "I'm not resisting," I said, my voice dropping an octave, becoming more serious. "I am complying. My ID is in my pocket. May I reach for it?" "Keep your hands up," the tall one yelled. Before I could breathe, he grabbed my arm and spun me around. My face was pressed against the cold, marble pillar. The smell of old stone and cleaning chemicals filled my nose. I felt the metal bite into my wrists. Click. That sound. It's a sharp, final sound. It's the sound of a gate closing. I felt the knees of my trousers hit the floor. The $3. 000 wool tore, I heard the fabric rip. A tiny sound that felt like my heart breaking. I was on the ground, in the middle of Penn Station, with handcuffs tightening around my wrists. My briefcase was kicked aside, sliding across the floor like trash. "Check his pockets," the tall one said. I closed my eyes. I could hear the footsteps of people walking around us. I could hear a child ask their mother why the man was in trouble. I didn't hear an answer. I felt their hands moving over me, invasive and rough. They weren't looking for an ID. They were looking for a reason to justify what they had already done. Nothing but a wallet and a phone, the shorter one muttered, his voice sounding a little less certain now. "Check the bag," the tall one ordered. They flipped my briefcase open. My laptop, my notes for the merger, the contracts that represented months of my life. They were tossed onto the floor, and then they found it, a small, velvet box. I felt a knot of pure agony in my chest. That box held something I hadn't even shown my wife yet. The officer picked it up and flipped it open. He stared at it for a second, then looked down at me. For the first time, I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Not regret. Maybe just confusion. But the tall one didn't care. He was still holding me down, his weight pressing into my back. "You think you can buy your way out of a description with a fancy watch?" he hissed in my ear. "It's not a watch," I whispered, my voice trembling now. "It's a legacy." The humiliation was a physical thing. It was a thick, oily film over my skin. I looked up and saw a woman filming us with her phone. She looked scared, or maybe she was just looking for a viral moment. I didn't know. I didn't care. I just wanted to wake up. I wanted to be back in my office, back in the world where I was Sir and Mr. CEO. But that world was gone. I was just a black man on the floor of a train station. And the clock on the wall was ticking toward a flight I was definitely going to miss. I felt the officer's grip tighten on my shoulder as he hauled me toward a standing position, my wrists screaming in protest against the steel. He didn't lead me toward the exit. He led me toward the dark, heavy doors of the security office, leaving my scattered life lying on the station floor behind us. I looked back one last time at the papers fluttering in the draft of a passing train, the white pages looking like fallen snow against the grime, and I realized the man who walked into this station wasn't the one being dragged out of it. The door to the back room slammed shut, the heavy thud echoing in the small, windowless space as the fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting a sickly yellow glow on the officer's face as he shoved me into a metal chair. The hum of those overhead lights was the only thing filling the space, a low, buzzing vibration that seemed to crawl under my skin and nestle right in the base of my skull. It was a sterile, lonely sound. I sat there, my hand still locked behind my back, feeling the coldness of the metal chair seeping through the expensive, now ruined fabric of my trousers. You ever notice how silence can feel heavy? In that room, it felt like lead. It felt like every second that ticked by on the clock above the door was a pound of pressure being added to my chest. I wasn't just a man in a room anymore. I was a problem to be solved, a file to be closed, a description that hadn't quite panned out yet. I kept my eyes on a scuff mark on the floor. I didn't want to look at the officer across from me. I didn't want to give him the satisfaction of seeing the storm brewing in my eyes, the mixture of hot rage and cold. Paralyzing humiliation. I'm a CEO. I lead people. I make decisions that affect hundreds of families. But in that sickly yellow light, I was reminded of a lesson my father taught me when I was 9 years old. Standing on a porch in Georgia, he told me, "Rowan, you can build a castle, but to some people, You'll always just be the man holding the bricks. I didn't understand it then. I understood it now. The door opened with a sharp creak. A second officer walked in, holding my ID and my boarding pass, like they were pieces of evidence from a crime scene. He didn't look at me. He looked at the paperwork. There was a long beat of silence, the kind of silence that happens right before a storm breaks. "Mr. Vance?" he asked, his voice lacking the bite it had 10 minutes ago. "That's me," I said, my voice raspier than I expected, as I've been trying to tell you. He sighed, a small, annoyed sound, as if my existence and the fact that I actually had a legal identity was a personal inconvenience to him. He leaned over and unlocked the handcuffs. The release was sudden. My blood rushed back into my hands, a stinging, prickling heat that made my fingers twitch. I didn't rub my wrists. I wouldn't give them that. I just sat there, letting my arms fall to my sides, feeling the phantom weight of the steel still lingering on my skin. "There was a misunderstanding," the tall one said, not looking me in the eye. "A robbery suspect in the lower terminal. Same height, same build, wearing a dark suit. You happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. I was at the train station," I said, my voice gaining strength. "That's not the wrong place. That's where people go to catch trains. You're free to go," he countered, ignoring my point entirely. "No apology. No sorry for tackling you in front of 100 people. No sorry we ruined your suit. Just a dismissal. Like I was a dog they'd accidentally put in a kennel and were now bored with." I stood up. My knees felt weak, like they were made of water, but I forced them to hold. I walked out of that room and back into the main terminal. It felt different now. The air felt thinner. The people rushing by seemed like blurs of color and noise, but I felt like I was moving through molasses. I found my briefcase near the pillar where they dropped it. My papers were scattered. My laptop had a fresh scratch on the lid, and that velvet box, the one I'd worked so hard to earn, was sitting lopsided on the floor. I knelt down to pick it all up. My hands were shaking. I'm a man who stays calm in a crisis. I've handled hostile takeovers without breaking a sweat. But here, on my knees on a dirty station floor, I couldn't stop the tremors in my fingers. It wasn't just the adrenaline. It was the realization that no matter how high I fly, the ground is always waiting to pull me back down in the most violent way possible. I checked my watch. My heart plummeted. I had 45 minutes to get to JFK. If I missed this flight, I missed the merger. If I missed the merger, 2 years of my life and the future of my employees would vanish. I didn't have time to be angry. I had to move. I flagged down a taxi. My movements robotic and stiff. The driver, a man with tired eyes and a radio playing soft jazz, didn't say a word as I climbed into the back. He just caught my eye in the rearview mirror, a long, knowing look that said he'd seen men who looked like me in states like this before. He knew the look of a man who'd just been reminded of his place in the world. "JFK," I muttered. "As fast as you can. Please." The ride was a blur of gray buildings and yellow lines. I tried to fix my suit. I tried to brush the dust off the knees where the fabric had frayed. I tried to straighten my tie, but my reflection in the window looked like a stranger. The man in the glass looked haunted. He looked small. I closed my eyes and tried to breathe, trying to find that center of gravity I usually carried so easily. "You are Rowan Vance," I told myself. "You are a builder. You are a leader." But the ghost of those handcuffs kept whispering something else. When we pulled up to the terminal, I overpaid the driver and ran. I didn't care about looking suspicious anymore. I just cared about the clock. I breezed through the VIP check-in, my status finally working for me. But every time I passed a security guard, my heart did a frantic little dance in my throat. I felt like I was walking on eggshells in a room full of hammers. I made it to the gate just as they were calling the final boarding for first class. I handed my ticket to the agent. She looked at the ticket, then at my disheveled suit, then back at the ticket. She gave me a tight, professional smile that didn't reach her eyes. The kind of smile you give someone you're not sure belongs there. "Enjoy your flight, Mr. Vance," she said. I walked down the jet bridge, the air growing cooler and the scent of jet fuel filling my lungs. This was my world. This was the place where I usually felt the most in control. I stepped onto the plane and found my seat. 2A, a wide, plush leather throne in the quiet sanctuary of the first-class cabin. I sat down and let out a breath I felt like I'd been holding since I left my house that morning. But the peace didn't last long. I felt it before I saw it. A shift in the atmosphere, a tightening of the air. To my left, in seat 2B, was a woman. She looked to be in her late 50s, wearing a string of pearls and a sweater that probably cost more than my first car. She was reading a magazine, but the second I sat down, the magazine lowered. She didn't look at me with curiosity. She looked at me with an immediate, visceral discomfort. It was a look I knew well. It's the look that says, "I'm safe in this expensive bubble, and you're a pin that might pop it." She adjusted her seat, pulling herself as far away from the armrest we shared as possible. Then, she did the thing that always cuts the deepest. She reached down, picked up her designer handbag from the floor, and tucked it tightly into the space between her hip and the side of the chair. She didn't even realize she was doing it. It was an instinct, a reflex. I stared straight ahead at the seat back in front of me. I wanted to turn to her and say, "Ma'am, I have more money in my checking account than you have in your retirement fund. I don't want your purse." But I didn't. I just sat there, feeling that eye-in-the-sky sensation. The flight attendants began their pre-flight checks. They moved through the cabin with grace, offering champagne and warm towels. When the young woman reached my row, she leaned over to the lady in 2B first, her voice a soft, melodic chirp. "Can I get you anything to start? Mrs. Gable?" "No, thank you." "Dear," the woman said, her voice trembling just a fraction. She leaned in closer to the attendant, her eyes darting toward me for a split second. She whispered something, too low for me to hear clearly, but the tone was unmistakable. It was the tone of concern. The flight attendant looked at me. Our eyes met for a heartbeat. Her smile flickered, just for a second, like a light bulb about to burn out. "And for you, sir?" she asked. Her tone was polite, but the warmth was gone. It was the same tone the officer at the station had used right before things went south. It was the "I'm watching you" voice. "Just water," I said. "Thank you." I leaned my head back and closed my eyes as the engines began to roar. A deep, guttural vibration that shook the entire frame of the aircraft. We started to taxi, the plane swaying gently as it moved toward the runway. Most people love this part, the anticipation of flight, the feeling of leaving the world behind. But all I could feel was the weight of the cabin. I felt like I was in a cage made of air and expensive leather. Every time I moved my arm to adjust my seat, I could feel the woman next to me flinch. Every time I reached into my pocket to check my phone, the flight attendant lingering in the galley would poke her head out to check on the cabin. I was a guest in first class, but I felt like an intruder. I was a success story on paper. But in this room, at 0 feet, I was just a shadow. The internal Muth one, that deep, aching contradiction, was tearing me apart. How could I be the man who was about to sign a deal worth millions, while also being the man who made a woman clutch her purse in fear? How could I be a titan of industry and a description at the same time? The complexity of it was a bitter pill to swallow. I thought about the teddy bear in my bag, the one I'd bought for my daughter, because I'd promised her I'd bring a piece of the city back for her. It was a simple, soft thing, a symbol of a father's love. And yet, if I reached for it now, would they see a toy, or would they see a threat? The plane accelerated, the force pressing me back into my seat. The ground fell away, the lights of New York shrinking into a grid of tiny, glowing embers. We were climbing, rising above the clouds, leaving the grid of Penn Station and the cold marble of the security room far below. But as the altitude increased, the pressure in my chest didn't let up. If anything, it got tighter. I looked out the window at the vast, dark expanse of the Atlantic. Up here, everything looked peaceful. Everything looked equal. From this high up, you can't see the suits. You can't see the skin. You can't see the fear. You just see the world. But I wasn't outside. I was inside. And inside this cabin, the air was thick with things left unsaid. I felt a bead of sweat roll down the side of my face. My mouth felt like it was full of sand. I needed that water. I looked toward the galley, waiting for the attendant to return. I saw her talking to another crew member, their heads huddled together, their eyes occasionally drifting toward row 2. I realized then that I wasn't just tired from the morning's events. I was exhausted from the performance of being one of the good ones, the performance of being extra polite, extra calm, extra invisible so as not to trigger the alarm in the people around me. It's a job I never applied for, but I've been working it every day of my life. I reached down to grab my briefcase from under the seat in front of me. I needed to look at the contracts. I needed to remind myself why I was here, why I endured the floor of the station and the whispers on the plane. I needed to see the numbers, the logic, the proof of my worth. As I pulled the bag toward me, the latch caught on the carpet. It made a sharp, metallic snap, a sound that, in the quiet of the cabin, sounded like a small explosion. The woman in 2B let out a sharp, audible gasp. She didn't just flinch this time. She nearly jumped out of her skin, her hand flying to her throat, her eyes wide with a terror that was as unfounded as it was insulting. She looked at me as if I'd pulled a weapon, her chest heaving, her pearls rattling against her neck. I froze. My hand was still on the handle of the briefcase. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just looked at her. And in that moment, the exhaustion finally won. I didn't feel like a CEO. I didn't feel like a success. I felt the raw, jagged edge of a wound that had been reopening all day long, a pain that went deeper than the bruises on my wrists. I slowly let go of the bag, my fingers uncurling one by one, and I sank back into the shadows of my seat, watching as the flight attendant began to walk toward us with a look of grim determination on her face. The footsteps were different this time. They weren't the light, airy clicks of someone offering a warm croissant or a refill on mimosas. They were heavy, purposeful. Each strike of her heel against the thin carpet felt like a hammer hitting a nail, driving the air right out of my lungs. I didn't look up immediately. I kept my gaze fixed on my own hands, watching the way my knuckles had turned a pale, ashy gray from gripping the armrests too hard. I felt the woman in 2B lean back even further, her perfume, something expensive and floral, wafting over me like a suffocating blanket. She was waiting for the cavalry, and she didn't have to wait long. "Sir." The voice was cold. It was that professional. Customer service cold that tells you you're no longer a customer. You're a liability. I finally lifted my head. The flight attendant stood there, her hands clasped in front of her, her face a mask of practiced neutrality. But her eyes, they were scanning me. They weren't looking at my face. They were looking for a bulge in my jacket, a twitch in my hands, a reason to hit the button that would ground this plane or bring the air marshals out of the shadows. Yes, I said. I tried to make my voice sound like the man who signs the paychecks, but it came out sounding like a man who had just spent an hour in a windowless room with the NYPD. Is there a problem with your luggage, Mr. Vance? My passenger mentioned an unusual sound, and you seem a bit agitated. Agitated. That's the word they love. Isn't it? It's the cousin of suspicious. If you're a black man in America and you aren't smiling like you just won the lottery every second of the day, you're agitated. If you're breathing hard because you're trying not to cry from the sheer, soul-crushing weight of being profiled twice in 4 hours, you're a threat. I was just reaching for my papers, I said, my voice steadying now. The CEO in me finally waking up from the shock. The latch on my bag caught. That's all? The woman in 2B chimed in then, her voice a sharp, nervous trill. He was shaking. He's been acting very strange ever since he boarded. And that sound, it sounded like something was being prepared. Prepared. You hear that? She didn't say opened. She said prepared. The language of fear is a hell of a thing. Man, it paints a picture without ever having to use a brush. She saw a man who looked like me, and her brain filled in a whole action movie where I was the villain. The attendant didn't even look at her. She kept her eyes on me. I'm going to have to ask you to let me see the bag. Sir, for the safety of the cabin. I felt the heat rise up the back of my neck. I looked around the cabin. Every head was turned. Every single person in first class was watching the show. I saw a young guy 3 rows back holding his phone up, probably recording. I saw an older man shake his head, not at the attendant, but at me, like I was the one ruining his quiet flight. The shame is the worst part. It's like a physical layer of grime that you can't wash off. No matter how many millions I make, no matter how many people I hire, in this moment, I was a 200-pound problem in an Italian suit. You ever feel like you're living in 2 worlds at once? One world is the one I worked for, the boardroom, the private jet, the house with the 3-car garage. The other world is the one I was born into, the one where I'm always one description away from being a headline. And right now, those 2 worlds were colliding at 30,000 feet. My bag is private property, I said, my voice dropping into that low, dangerous register I use when a negotiation is going south. I have already cleared security. I have already been detained today for no reason. I am not going through this again. Sir, if you don't comply, we will have to divert the flight, the attendant said. Her hand moved toward her radio. The silence in the cabin was deafening. You could hear the hum of the engines, the rattle of a tray table, the frantic beating of my own heart. I looked at the woman in 2B. She looked terrified, genuinely terrified. And that's what broke something inside of me. She wasn't a monster. She was just someone who had been taught to fear the shadow I cast. But why did I have to be the one to pay for her education? Why was my dignity the currency she used to feel safe? Fine, I whispered. You want to see what's in the bag? Look. I reached down. I felt every eye in that plane lock onto my fingers. I moved slowly, deliberately, like I was handling a bomb. I didn't want any agitated movements. I didn't want anyone to have an excuse to say they feared for their life. I unzipped the side pocket of the briefcase. I reached in and pulled out the small, velvet box they'd seen at the station. I popped the lid. Inside was a watch. But it wasn't just a watch. It was a vintage Patek Philippe, a piece of art that cost more than some people make in a year. It was a gift for the man I was meeting, a peace offering, a sign of respect for a merger that was supposed to be the crowning achievement of my career. "Is this the threat?" I asked, holding it up so the woman could see the gold glinting in the cabin lights. She looked away, her face turning a deep, blotchy red, but I wasn't done. I reached into the main compartment of the bag. I pulled out the contracts, the legal briefs, the blueprints for the new headquarters. I let them fan out across my lap. "Is it the legal jargon? Does the font scare you?" I was being petty now. I know. But when you've been stripped of your humanity, you try to claw back whatever pieces you can find. Then, my hand hit something soft, something that didn't belong in a CEO's briefcase. I pulled it out. It was a teddy bear, a small, raggedy thing with one button eye and a faded blue ribbon around its neck. It was my daughter Maya's favorite toy. She'd snuck it into my bag this morning when I wasn't looking. She does that every time I go on a long trip. She tells me, "Papa, take Barnaby so you don't get lonely." The sight of that bear in this sterile, hostile cabin was like a punch to the gut. I looked at Barnaby, and I saw my daughter's face. I saw the way she looked at me like I was a superhero. To her, I wasn't a description. I wasn't a threat. I was just Papa, and here I was, fighting for my life in a room full of people who couldn't see the man for the melanin. The flight attendant's posture softened, just a fraction. I see, Mr. Vance. I apologized for the intrusion. "Do you?" I asked, my voice cracking just a little. "Do you really?" I looked at the woman in 2B. She wouldn't look at me. She was staring at her magazine like it held the secrets to the universe. I've spent my whole life trying to be twice as good to get half as far. I said, loud enough for the first 3 rows to hear. I wasn't talking to them. Really, I was talking to the world. I put on the suit. I got the degrees. I built the company. I pay my taxes. And yet, I can't even fly across the country without being treated like a criminal because I'm a little agitated. You want to know why I'm agitated? I'm agitated because I'm tired. I am exhausted from having to prove I belong in a seat I paid for. The guy with the phone stopped recording. The cabin was dead silent. Even the air seemed to stop moving. I felt a tear prick the corner of my eye, but I wouldn't let it fall. Not here. Not in front of them. I put the bear back in the bag. I put the watch back. I zipped it shut with a finality that felt like a door slamming. "I don't want your champagne," I told the attendant. "I don't want your water. I just want to get to my destination." She nodded, her face pale, and retreated to the galley. The woman in 2B didn't move for the rest of the flight. She didn't go to the bathroom. She didn't order food. She just sat there, encased in her own shame. And me? I sat there with Barnaby in my lap, my hand resting on his soft, worn fur. I started thinking about the merger. The man I was meeting, a titan of industry, an old-school billionaire. I'd never met him in person, only through lawyers and Zoom calls. He was the final boss, the one who could make or break everything I'd built. And for the first time, I felt a flicker of doubt. If the world on the ground was like this, and the world in the air was like this, what was waiting for me in that boardroom? Was I walking into another trap? Was I going to walk into that high-rise office just to be told that I fit the description of someone they didn't want to partner with? I looked at my reflection in the window again. The sky was turning a bruised purple as we chased the sunset. I looked at the graying hair at my temples, the lines around my eyes. I looked like a man who had won a lot of battles, but was losing the war. But then I felt the bear. I felt the love of a 7-year-old girl who believed in me. And I realized that I couldn't go into that meeting as the victim they tried to make me today. I had to go in as the man Maya thinks I am. I'm curious. Guys, have you ever reached a point where you just stopped trying to fit in? Where you decided that if the world wasn't going to give you a seat at the table, you'd just build your own table? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one of them, and your stories are what keep me going. If you haven't yet, subscribe. We've got one more part to this story, and trust me, you don't want to miss how this ends. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, a low, distorted rumble. Ladies and gentlemen, we've begun our initial descent into Los Angeles. Please make sure your seatbelts are fastened and your tray tables are stowed. I felt the nose of the plane dip. The sensation of falling, that sudden, lightheaded drop, hit me harder than usual. We were going back down, back to the ground, back to the reality of the street. I reached into my bag one more time and pulled out my phone. I had 3 missed calls from my lead counsel. 1 text message from the CEO I was supposed to meet. It just said, "Looking forward to seeing the man behind the legend. Don't be late." I gripped the phone so hard the screen smudged. I looked at the watch in the velvet box, then at the torn fabric on my knee. I had 90 minutes to get from the tarmac to the 50th floor. I didn't have time to change. I didn't have time to heal. I just had time to be Rowan Vance. As the wheels touched the runway with a violent jar and the engine screamed in reverse, I didn't reach for my bag. I just sat there, watching the blurred lights of the runway zip past. My heart already miles away in a room where the stakes were higher than I ever imagined. Feeling the first cold drops of a new kind of tension beginning to sweat through the palms of my hands. The terminal at LAX felt like a giant, glass-walled hive, buzzing with an energy that felt completely disconnected from the cold. Heavy lump sitting in the pit of my stomach. I stepped off the jet bridge, my legs feeling like they belonged to someone else. Stiff, mechanical, and weary. I didn't look back at row 2. I didn't need to. The image of Mrs. Gable clutching her pearls was burned into the back of my retinas. A permanent slide in the carousel of things I wish I could forget. I kept my head down, my hand tightening around the handle of my briefcase, feeling the jagged edge of the torn fabric on my knee every time I took a step. It was a reminder, a brand, a mark of a day that had tried to strip me of everything I'd spent 40 years becoming. I made my way through the airport, weaving through the crowds of tourists in Hawaiian shirts and business travelers who looked far more composed than I felt. I ducked into the first restroom I found, pushing through the heavy door and heading straight for the mirrors. I needed to see him. I needed to see if Rowan Vance was still in there, or if he'd been left behind on the floor of Penn Station. The man in the mirror looked tired. That was the first thing. The lines around my eyes seemed deeper, carved out by a day of holding my breath. I took off my jacket, revealing the sweat-stained shirt underneath. I grabbed a handful of paper towels, soaked them in cold water, and pressed them to my face. The chill was a shock to the system, a momentary pause in the static of my brain. I looked down at my trousers. The tear was small, but in this lighting, it looked like a gaping wound. I tried to smooth the wool, but the fibers were frayed. Beyond repair, I was heading into the biggest merger of my life, looking like I'd been in a street fight. And in a way, I had been. I took a deep breath, straightened my posture, and put the jacket back on. I buttoned it, hiding the rip as best I could. I looked at myself, really looked, and I saw the teddy bear's ear poking out of the side pocket of my briefcase. I didn't tuck it back in. I let it stay there. A little bit of truth in a world of polished lies. "You got this," I whispered to the glass. "You've survived worse than a train station floor." The car service was waiting at the curb, a black SUV that blended into the LA landscape. The driver held the door open, his face a mask of professional indifference. I climbed into the back, the leather cool and smelling of new car scent and ambition. As we pulled away from the curb and headed toward the glittering skyline of downtown LA, I felt the shift, the transition. I was leaving the world where I was a description and entering the world where I was a legend. But the two were starting to feel like the same place. The skyscraper was a monolith of steel and glass, reaching up into the hazy California sun like it was trying to touch the face of God. I stepped out of the car and looked up. This was it. The 50th floor, the room where the future was decided. I walked through the lobby, my shoes clicking on the polished marble, a sound that usually made me feel powerful. But today, it just felt loud. I felt the security guard's eyes on me. I didn't flinch. I didn't offer an ID until he asked. I didn't smile. I just existed. The elevator ride was a silent, vertical journey through the layers of my own life. Floors 1 through 10. The struggle. The student loans. The nights I ate cereal for dinner. Floors 10 through 30. The climb. The mid-level management. The first time I realized I was the only person in the room who looked like me. Floors 30 through 49. The success. The company. The hard-won respect. And then, the bell chimed. Floor 50. The door slid open to a reception area that looked like a museum. Minimalist art. Sweeping views of the Hollywood Hills. And a silence so thick you could cut it with a knife. A young woman at the desk looked up, her expression shifting from curiosity to recognition. "Mr. Vance, they're waiting for you in the boardroom. Right this way." I followed her down the long, carpeted hallway. Every office we passed felt like a world unto itself. I could see the executives through the glass walls, men and women in sharp suits, talking about margins and growth. I wondered if any of them had ever been tackled on a Tuesday morning. I wondered if any of them had a teddy bear in their bag. She opened the double oak doors at the end of the hall, and I stepped into the room. The boardroom was massive. A long, mahogany table sat in the center, surrounded by chairs that looked more like thrones. At the far end, silhouetted against the floor-to-ceiling windows, stood a man. He was tall, silver-haired, and possessed an aura of effortless authority. "Rowan," he said, turning around. His voice was a rich, gravelly baritone. "You're late. I had some trouble with my commute." "Arthur," I said, walking toward him. I didn't apologize. I just stated the fact. "So I heard," he replied, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I saw a video on Twitter about 10 minutes ago. A man in a very expensive suit getting handled quite roughly at Penn Station. I assume that was you." I felt a jolt of electricity go through my spine. The world is too small. Man, too small for secrets and too fast for privacy. I stood there, my briefcase in my hand, my heart hammering against my ribs. "It was, I said. "And the flight?" he asked, stepping closer. "I hear there was a bit of a disturbance in first class." I paused. I looked around the room, and that's when I saw her, sitting at the side of the table, half hidden by a laptop screen, was the woman from 2B, Mrs. Gable. She wasn't wearing her pearls anymore, and she didn't look terrified. She looked small, shrunken. She was staring at the table, her face the color of ash. "Rowan, I'd like you to meet our senior vice president and head of ethics, Margaret Gable," Arthur said, his voice dropping into a tone that was impossible to read. The irony was a physical weight. The woman who had clutched her purse in fear of me was the one in charge of the ethics of the company I was about to merge with. I felt a laugh, a real, genuine, bitter laugh, climb up my throat. I didn't suppress it this time. I let it out. It echoed in the sterile room, a jagged sound that tore through the pretense of the meeting. "Ethics," I repeated, the word tasting like copper in my mouth. "That's a beautiful title, Margaret." She finally looked up. Her eyes were red-rimmed. "Mr. Vance, I didn't know who you were. That's the problem, isn't it?" I said, walking over to the table and setting my briefcase down. I didn't sit. I leaned over the mahogany, my face inches from hers. "You didn't know I was a CEO. You didn't know I was a partner. So you decided I was a threat. You decided that my presence in a seat I paid for was a violation of your safety. I was nervous," she whispered. "The news. The things people say. The things people say." I mocked softly. "I spent my morning on the floor of a train station because I fit a description. I spent my afternoon defending my right to breathe on a plane because you were agitated. And now I'm standing in a boardroom worth $400 million. And you're telling me you didn't know who I was." Arthur moved to the table, his expression unreadable. "Rowan, we've been working on this deal for 18 months. Margaret is a valued member of this team. Let's stay focused on the merger." I turned to him. I looked at the silver hair, the custom suit, the handmade shoes. I looked at the man who had never been a description in his life. "The merger is about more than numbers, Arthur," I said. I reached into my bag and pulled out the teddy bear. I set it on the table, right next to the $400 million contract. Barnaby looked ridiculous there, his one-button eye staring up at the fluorescent lights. "What is that?" Arthur asked, genuinely confused. "That's my humanity," I said. "That's the reason I do this. That's my daughter's favorite toy. And it's the only thing that kept me sane today, while your head of ethics was trying to have me removed from a flight." I looked at Margaret, then back to Arthur. "I'm not signing," I said. The silence that followed was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop on the other side of the building. Arthur's face went pale. "Rowan, don't be emotional. This is business. This is the most business-related decision I've ever made," I countered. "I'm not merging my life's work with a company that employs people who see me as a criminal before they see me as a peer. If you want my company, if you want my vision, you have to want all of me, not just the parts that fit into your balance sheet. You have to want the man who gets tackled at Penn Station, too." I picked up the teddy bear and tucked it back into my bag. I picked up my briefcase. I felt a lightness I hadn't felt all day. The weight, that mountain I'd been carrying on my shoulders, was gone. I dropped it right there on their expensive mahogany table. "Rowan, wait," Margaret said, her voice shaking. "I'm sorry. I truly am." I stopped at the door. I didn't turn around. "I know you are, Margaret. You're sorry because I'm a CEO. But if I was just a man in a blue suit on a train, you wouldn't be sorry at all. And that's the difference between us." I walked out. I didn't wait for the elevator. I took the stairs for a few flights just to feel the blood pumping in my legs, to feel the reality of my own movement. By the time I hit the lobby, the sun was starting to dip below the horizon, painting the LA sky in streaks of gold and fire. I stepped out onto the sidewalk. The air was warm, smelling of jasmine and exhaust. I looked at my reflection in the glass of the building. The ripped knee, the tired eyes, the rumpled suit. I looked like a man who had lost a $400 million deal. But as I started to walk, I realized I'd never felt richer. I pulled out my phone and called home. "Hey, baby," I said when my wife answered. "I'm coming home." No, the deal didn't go through. But I'm bringing Barnaby back. And I'm bringing myself back. To all of me. I hung up and looked at the city. It's a beautiful world. Man, it's a broken, messy, complicated world. But it's beautiful when you stop trying to hide from it. I want to leave you with this. Success isn't about the rooms you get into. It's about the person you are when you walk out of them. It's about not letting the world's description of you become your own. If you've ever had to walk away from something big to keep something bigger, your soul, let me know in the comments. We're in this together. I'm Rowan Vance, and this is my truth. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Keep the light on. I'll see you in the next one. I turned the corner, the shadow of the skyscraper falling behind me, and I started to whistle a tune my father used to sing. My step steady and sure as the first stars began to peek through the California haze.